Chapter 4, verses 12 through 17. They related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him.
Good morning. Y'all glad to be here? I'm glad to be home. I enjoyed our vacation, but I am glad to be home. My wife's not with me this morning. We think she just has a little bit of bronchitis from all the weather change going back and forth and the weather that we experienced while we were going, but she had about 1 degree of fever, so we decided better stay home than to take a chance on getting somebody else sick. So hopefully she'll be back this next time. I want to share one experience from my cruise, and then we'll watch all 17,000 slides. We went to a place in Iona in Nova Scotia, and it's called a Highland Village, and they've restored an ancient Highland village from back in the time of Scotland up until like the 1850s or so, and they have houses, and as you go from house to house and place to place, you move forward about 20 years throughout this period of time. And it's pretty amazing because the people are in costume and they speak in costume pretty much. It's pretty amazing. But one of the things that I absolutely loved, we found a church building from 1782. That's before there was a United States of America. We found a church building from 1782 that had been moved to that site, and they had it set up. And me being me, I had to get up behind the pulpit and preach. Not very long. I only had my sister and my wife there in the audience. But I had to preach a little bit, and then I had to lead a song, and I led the doxology. And it was amazing in this old wooden structure. It was just absolutely amazing. I found something out that I didn't know. The Scottish Presbyterians, when they moved over to Nova Scotia and brought their religion with them, one of the things they absolutely forbade was the use of any mechanical instruments in their worship services. They sang what we would call and response songs. They would have a deacon who sat right in front of the pulpit here, and there were chairs there for the deacons. He would sit right there, and he would sing a line, and then the congregation would repeat it, and he would sing another line, and the congregation would repeat it. And for a small price, you could buy a CD of something like that. I don't own that CD. Anyhow, moving forward, we are looking this week at Mordecai. He's a kind of an interesting character. We've been looking the last few weeks at the rest of the story and talking a little bit. We saw in Joseph's life how we learned a lesson from there that no matter what happens, God is still in control. Whether there are huge storms at home, whether there are huge storms in our life, God is still in control no matter what's going on in the world around us. We saw in the lives of Hannah and Samuel that God answers prayer. Here this barren woman came to God and said, "If you'll give me a son, I'll dedicate him to you for all the days of his life." And God did, and she did. And we saw that God answers prayer. We noted throughout Joshua's life that he learned to trust God. He could stand and be strong. He could stand and be courageous because God was always with him. And we drew from that God is always with us. Then we saw Barak defeat Sisera at the direction of Deborah as we looked at that. And the reason he was able to do that is because he trusted God. We learned that we can overcome whatever adversaries we face when we trust God. We looked a little bit further and we saw Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. And we saw that we have to be willing to tell the truth and speak the truth of God's word, even when it's not popular in the society we live in. That's what he had to face and what he had to do. And we learned a very practical lesson from the life of Jeremiah. And as we continue with the rest of the story, I put that picture of Paul Harvey in there because some of our younger people probably have no clue who he was. And by the way, if you're on Spotify, you can look up Paul Harvey and you can actually subscribe to his podcasts, even though there haven't been any of them made for a long time. And you can listen to Paul Harvey explain the news, and he always begins, and now Americans, and then he tells the rest of the story. I think it's amazing as we looked at that. But this week we're looking at Mordecai. That's an actual photo. We know very little about Mordecai's actual background. We really don't. The scriptures don't tell us a whole lot about who he was. That he was a Jew is pretty obvious. That he lived in Susa, the capital of Babylon, is expressly stated in scripture. That he had a cousin, maybe a niece, depending on what translation you're reading from, named Hadassah. We call her Esther in our modern translations. But that he had a niece or cousin. We're not sure for sure. The Hebrew's a little vague on that, and I don't speak Hebrew, so I'll take my English translation. It's like niece, sister, cousin. No, it's niece or cousin. I'm not sure which. Esther 2 tells us a little bit about Mordecai. So there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So we know when he was taken captive. We know he was carried in during the destruction of Jerusalem. We know he was taken in as one of those original prisoners from Judah into Babylon. So we can set a time frame on that. It was about 586 BC. About that time. We can set that time frame pretty close to know when this is taking place, okay, so that we know that a little bit. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. Now, obviously, she had a father or mother at some point, but her father and mother were no longer around. Possibly, during the siege of Jerusalem, they died because many Jews starved to death during that time. Possibly, during the conquest of Jerusalem, they had been killed because many Jews were killed during that time. Possibly they didn't survive the transit to Babylonia. In our own history, if you look just a few blocks over here, there's a monument to the Trail of Tears and how many people were unable to survive being relocated to another land. And so we see those things even in our world today, and we can understand those things a little bit. We look at that, but she had neither father or mother anymore. She's an orphan. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. So all we really know about this situation between them is that her parents were dead, and Mordecai decided to take her as his own. We don't know much more about that. We don't know if his wife was still living. We don't know if his wife was deceased. We don't know if he had children of his own or if he didn't have children of his own. What we do know is that he had a heart big enough to take in this orphaned family member and to make sure that she was going to be taken care of. We also know something else about him from reading into the text. He must have been very important among the Jewish people of his day. And the reason I say that is because it says he sat within the gates daily. There's a phrase there, it's a Hebrew phrase, this sitting within the gates, that means that he was a leader of the people. He was maybe a judge of the people, maybe an elder of the Jews. He was one of those that they would go to for wisdom and to consult things. The indications from this phrase in Hebrew are that he is someone of significance. Remember, Job was referred to as one who sat in the gate, and people came to him to hear his wisdom. Remember also in Joshua 20, in the law of God, it says the manslayer can flee to the entrance of the city, to the gates, and the elders would be there. You see that? He went to the city gates, the elders would be sitting in the gates, and that way he could find refuge. Abraham went to those who sat in the gate when he wanted to buy the field of Machpelah so that he could bury Sarah there. And so he went to the gates. In Ruth chapter 4, Boaz came to the gate and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city. Where were they at? They were there at the gates. That's where the leaders were. That's where they met. They sat at the city gates, and you could find them there. When Lot was accused by the men of Sodom, you remember what they accused him of? They said, "You're trying to become a judge over us," because he sat in the gates of the city. And so they assumed he was trying to become a judge. Deuteronomy 21, when God is telling his people the law concerning disobedient and rebellious children, especially sons, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city. Where are they at? They're at the gate. So the fact that Mordecai is sitting at the gate means that he is someone of significance. I think sometimes we miss that when we're reading the story. We think maybe Mordecai is just another Jew, but he's not. He's an important figure. Maybe that's why Haman would hate all the Jews, because Mordecai to him represented all of the Jews. He was in a position of authority there. And so maybe that's why that is, because when Haman decides to do away with the Jews, he wants to kill them all. If Mordecai had been someone insignificant, Haman could have just made him disappear. If he was nobody, you just make nobody disappear, and nobody's even going to miss him. But Mordecai was somebody he couldn't just go after without any need or any desire or any will or any evidence. And so, again, it bears up he might be somebody important. Modern Jewish rabbis say that the whole story of Esther is there, and it tells the story of Mordecai's selfish arrogance in not bowing down to Haman, and that Haman wanted to kill the Jews because of Mordecai's selfish arrogance. And they teach their children, don't be arrogant, because if you're arrogant, all the people will have to suffer. That's what they use to teach that lesson. But and they also say that since he was working as a gate guard, those people that were plotting against the king would have never done so in his hearing. So the story is really a myth. According to modern Jewish rabbis, according to modern Jewish scholars, this is just a myth. It's just a story. It's in there. It's a nice story. And it's in there simply to explain why they celebrate the Feast of Purim. I have a couple of questions about that. If that's the case, then why do they celebrate the Feast of Purim? Why did they have to come up with a story to explain it? No, I think it's in there because it's true, and I think we ought to understand that. And that's an important thing to do. And by the way, the scripture doesn't depict him as a gate guard, but rather one who sits within the gate. He sits within the gate. And so with all that in mind, let's look this morning for a little bit at Mordecai and see it. And I'm calling this a dad for all seasons, maybe because today's Father's Day, and what a great time to talk about this. Maybe I planned it that way a long time ago, that that's what we would do. The first thing we see about Mordecai is he was devoted. He was devoted. He was devoted in all his life. He was devoted to his family. He was devoted to his people. And I believe even though there's no mention that he was directly devoted to God, I believe he was devoted to God in all of the aspects of his life, because we see that through his life and we see that through his thing. His family was important to him. Esther's parents are both deceased. It would have been a very difficult and dangerous world for a young Jewish girl living in Susa. It would have been a very difficult thing, especially if she were attractive, because any Babylonian male who wanted to could take her for his own, and she would have zero say in the matter. I don't know that we think of things like that or recognize things like that in the society we live in today, because that's abhorrent to us. But that was the world that this girl was growing up in. So it was important that Mordecai take her under his wing and say, hey, she's going to be protected. Remember, we've already determined he's an important person. Being under his protection is going to keep her safe in the community that she lives in. And so that's an important aspect of her life as she does that. Again, some versions say niece, some versions say cousin. Apparently there's some ambiguity here in the Hebrew text. I don't speak Hebrew. I just have to take the word of the different English versions, and some say niece, some say cousin, and I'll take it at niece, cousin, whichever it is, and we'll accept that she was an orphan that he took to raise. And I'll accept that very well. He raised her as his own daughter. You know, there are opportunities sometimes that you might have an influence on somebody else's children, but to raise them as your own, that's something special. That takes a special heart to raise someone as your own. We mentor others, we teach classes, and we have children come up through our classes, and we do different things with children, and we watch them grow, and we have some, but to raise them as our own, that means to take their problems unto ourselves. And I think sometimes, again, we're so focused on Esther that we miss Mordecai in this part of the thing. He was concerned for her future. He provided strong guidance and counsel for her. In fact, his guidance for her was so strong that she was prepared for all the challenges she faced when she became queen. You ever think about that? Where did she get the courage to stand up to the king? Where did she get the courage to go in and speak to the king? Here's another one. Where did she get the humility to consult with one of the eunuchs before she went to see the king? I think most of us don't pay much attention to servants around us. Those who serve in restaurants or those who serve in various places. Do you know the name of the waitress who served you your last meal? You do if it was mom. But other than that, I'm not sure that we know or notice that much the servants, but she did. She did, because she was brought up with integrity by this man. Dads, here's a challenge. Dads, here's a real challenge for you on this Father's Day. Raise up strong, confident daughters who are able to face all the challenges of the world and still be proud of their femininity. There's you a challenge. And that's a tough challenge. That's hard, but we need to do that. We need to work on that. The next thing we see is his people were important. For those of you who don't recognize Frederick Douglass' picture, shame on you. But his people were important. Frederick Douglass stood up for his people, and maybe as much as anyone of his time. And so I thought he would be a good example of that. Again, sitting in the gates implies leadership and responsibility. You know, one of the hardest qualities to find in leadership is someone who's willing to take responsibility. A lot of people are more than willing to say, yeah, I'll be the leader. Put me in charge. I don't mind being the boss at all. But when it comes time to make the tough decisions and then be responsible for the consequences of those decisions, you don't find as many people willing to do that. It's hard. Maybe that's why God, in his wisdom, decided that a church needed a plurality of elders so that they could bear the burden together. And aren't you glad we have men here who are willing to shoulder the burden of leadership in our church? Because they have a tremendous responsibility. It's even said that they'll answer for our souls. That's a huge responsibility. It's a huge task and a huge burden. Mordecai is one of those people. You know, it can be lonely when you have to make decisions, and I'm sure Mordecai spent much of his time lonely like that. Here's a question for you, dads. Are your people important? The people around you? I don't mean just your immediate family, your wife and your children, although they're included in that idea. But what about your extended family? What about your friends and neighbors? What about your co-workers? What about your boss or your country or your elders or your church family? Are they important to you? Do you care about them enough to maybe, as Mordecai did, risk your life for them? And I'm going to say this in as much love as I can. Our children learn what they see. They learn what they live. It's an old saying. It's just as true as it ever was. Are you someone who shows your children commitment to others? Or are you someone who shows your children as they're growing up that they or you are more important than anyone around you? There's a lesson there that's being taught every single day of our life. Mordecai's God was important to him. He spoke his faith out loud when he spoke to Esther, and he said, hey, if you don't deliver the people, that's okay. God will raise up somebody else. But how do you know God didn't put you in the palace for this very reason and this very purpose? He understood God's going to take care of things. He understood God's in charge. He understood it's all about God. He taught her it's all about God. And then he told her, but sometimes God wants you to do something. And God puts you in a special place because he wants you to do something. He was very, very, very dedicated to this thought. Remember for a minute, he raised this girl as his own daughter. He knows that if she goes to the king unannounced, her life is in jeopardy. Dads, those of you who have daughters, are you going to encourage your daughter to go do something that's probably going to get her killed? No. In fact, you're going to probably encourage her a different direction. This man's dedication to his God was enough that he knew God would watch over. And I think we need to have that. We need to understand that. And the question today, dads, do your children know how much you love the Lord? Do they know that? Have you taught them that? Have you shared your hopes for their growth and spiritual development? Have you shared your hopes that their faith might become as strong as yours? Have you modeled faith and fidelity in your walk with the Lord? Have you left any doubts in the minds of your children about how important your relationship with God is? And if you have, it's not too late to fix that. It's not too late to make those things right. We need to do that. We need to understand that. The next thing we see about Mordecai is he was available. He was available. One of the things that we need to understand in life is one of the greatest needs other people have is for us to just be there. When someone loses a loved one, they don't need my fancy words. A lot of times they just need a shoulder to cry on, or an understanding nod, or a listening ear instead of an open mouth. Oftentimes, we just need to be there. And that's, as much as anything, one of the things that we see in Mordecai. He was available to Esther. He was available to his people when they came to the gates, and he was able to judge their situations that were going on. And he was available to God when it's time to do the things of God. When the time came that Esther needed Mordecai, sorry, I couldn't help putting it in there. When the time came that Esther needed someone, Mordecai was there. One of the most important jobs as a father is simply to be there. When children need security, when they need comfort, mom's the one they turn to. But when they need security, they want dad to watch over them. They feel safer when dad's around. I've heard, I don't know how many children say, I can do anything when my dad's there. And I don't know how many kids that are terrified when their dad is not around. I remember when I was growing up at Poughkeepsie, when I was little bitty, about 4 or 5 years old, we had an outhouse. Those of you that remember outhouses know what I'm talking about. Those of you who don't, bless you. But there was a little screen of privacy hedge that had grown wild in between the house and the outhouse, and the reason was to keep the smell from the outhouse from drifting to the main house. But when you're 4 or 5 years old, and you've heard the story about the 3 bears, you know all 3 of them live in those hedges. And you know they come out every night and they're waiting to eat you between your house and getting to the outhouse. But my dad would walk out on the back porch. He smoked, and back then he would walk out on the back porch. He'd smoke a cigarette and walk around or sit down on the steps when we needed to go to the outhouse. And we knew, as long as Daddy was there, we're safe. As long as Daddy is there, we're safe. Dads, That's one of your number one responsibilities for your family, is for them to know that as long as you're around, they are safe. And if you can provide that for your children, you've provided one of the greatest things. By the way, if you can provide that for your wife, you've provided one of the greatest needs they have in the world. And so it's important to have that part. But there's more to it than that. When they need support and advice, there's no one like a godly father to give it to them. And God gave you, as a dad, the responsibility of teaching your children about him. He didn't give that responsibility to Rod in the youth group. He didn't give that responsibility to Miss Ninette in the Bible class. He didn't give that responsibility to somebody else to teach, or to George from the pulpit. He gave that responsibility to dads to teach our children about God. Now, all the rest of the tools we have, we should use. And we should take advantage of every opportunity for that. What we see about Mordecai, he may not have been her biological father, but he was her dad in every sense of the word. And we need to understand that that's very, very capable. You know, I love that. He trained her. He trained her. He brought her up right. And that's what we see, is he brought her up right, and she was ready. She was strong when the time came to face the challenges of her life. She was ready to face them. You know, when the time came that the people needed him to stand up, he was available. One of the most wonderful things about our church family is our availability to serve. I mean, in our community and throughout the world, we serve. We have members that serve and volunteers in so many different areas of our community and different committees and different organizations that it'd be impossible to name them all up here. We just run out of time trying to do it. We've got teachers and coaches that are touching lives every single day. We have, when a storm or disaster hits, the community knows they can turn to us for help. We're those people. We're the ones they can depend on. We're the ones that are committed, that they know they can trust when things like that happen. And, you know, our folks travel from Ohio to Texas to Louisiana to Florida to Bologna to New Mexico and even to Ecuador to reach out and touch and bring hope. Oh, yeah, I love that. Just like Mordecai, we're kind of committed to our people, aren't we? I like that. I like that that's part of what we do. Our contributions go throughout the globe, teaching people about Jesus, digging a well where there's no clean water, or sharing the love of God with the downtrodden, and opening the eyes of people who are blind to God's love, and showing them that he cares. You know, in the same way, when Mordecai's people were in need, he couldn't just sit there and watch. He couldn't, do nothing. It's kind of like our members when Rod sends out one of those text messages. Here's a text message from Rod, and you read it, and it says, be here at 8 o'clock. You're like, okay, I'll be there at 8 o'clock. Or we need contributions. Okay, we can provide contributions. Or whatever it is. If you're on Rod's text list, you know what I'm talking about. And I tell you something else, when he sends out a text, responses are immediate, aren't they, Rod? I mean, it's immediate, and all of a sudden needs are being met, and care is being shown, and love is the proof that we are, in fact, the disciples of Christ as we follow through our life. When it came time to do God's business, Mordecai was available for that too. It was just absolutely amazing back then when you look at, that's an actual picture of Mordecai's family. Maybe not. We've already touched on the effect he had on Esther's life as she was growing up. Here's a man who had raised up a child in the way she should go. And when she was older, she didn't depart from that direction. Here's a man who had obviously taught the young girl from a young age about the Lord and his ways. Here's a man who was able to do whatever God needed him to do, whenever God needed him to do it. But the next thing we see about Mordecai, he was dedicated. He was determined. He was determined. And, he was determined to see to his family's needs. You know, if you want to know what real determination is, there's a picture of real determination right there. You know, he's determined. We don't know about his wife. We don't know about his own children. We don't know anything about that. We know nothing of Esther's immediate family other than the fact that her parents were dead. But when the chips were down and this girl needed guidance, he was there for her. You know, he could have stepped away and said, well, she's not my responsibility, not my kid. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I guarantee you, as I look out here, I see at least 25 or 30 people in this congregation who are actively involved in the lives of children who are not their kids. Not because they have to, but because the kids need them. And because they love. And because they care. How amazing was that? How amazing is that? You know, after she was chosen to be queen, he could have washed his hands and said, she's no longer my responsibility. Somebody else can take care of that kid from now on. But he didn't do that either. She was still his. I heard a poem years ago, your son's your son till he takes a wife, but your daughter's your daughter for all of her life, or something like that. Don't know that that's absolutely true, but I sure like to hear my daughter's voice. It's not discounting the fact that I like to hear my son's voice too. He was determined to take care of his people. You know, one of the reasons rabbis don't like this story in modern day is because they don't like the idea that a woman could have that much responsibility. But maybe it's because he trained up a strong woman that she was able to have responsibility and to take responsibility. You know, I think we're afraid sometimes of raising up strong daughters. We're afraid of where they'll go. We need them. They need us. We ought to have that, and we ought to be working on that all the time. You know, but we see him in this context risking his life for his people. That was, to me, risking your life for your people is one of the greatest things you can do. Being willing to sacrifice yourself if that's what it takes. You know, again, there's some discussions among scholars about why Mordecai refused to bow to Haman. Some say that he was arrogant or proud. Others say that as a devout Jew, he would only bow to God, and so that's why he wouldn't bow to Haman. Others say it may have been a personal thing between him and Haman. Haman was kind of arrogant himself, and maybe Mordecai just wanted to put Haman in his place. Most of the people say it was because Haman was condescending to the Jews, and that Mordecai just wouldn't give him deference because he treated the Jews with such disrespect. And I can accept any one of those, but probably the latter is the easiest for me to understand. So, at any rate, Scripture's clear. He refused to bow to Haman, but he was more than willing to stand up for his people. And so that's what we have to see. The other thing we see about his determination, he was determined to trust God. He was determined to trust his God. He knew the prophecies about the Jews returning home from Babylon. He knew God's going to deliver them at some point from slavery and captivity. If he had a copy of Jeremiah, he would know that in 70 years they were going home. But he probably didn't have that copy of Jeremiah, but he probably had heard some of those prophecies. He probably knew that it was a 70-year thing if he truly trusted in God, as it seems he did. He's looking forward to the end of the oppression because he trusted God. And even as the seemingly inevitable was in sight, he never stopped believing and he never lost faith. And when the opportunity presented for him to take a stand for the Lord, he did. So now, as Paul Harvey would say, we come to the rest of the story. Mordecai's devotion and ability and determination resulted in the salvation of his people. Yes, the Feast of Purim is a celebration of Queen Esther and her faith. But have you ever thought about this? Without Mordecai's guidance, without Mordecai's influence, without Mordecai's strength in raising this girl as his own daughter, Queen Esther would have never been Queen Esther. And she would have never had the strength that she needed when the challenges faced her. You know, then you have what's left, simply an attractive young girl who may or may not have ever met the king and who may or may not have ever been anyone of any importance whatsoever. But because of the strength of the man who raised her, she's a strong, confident woman. The rest of the story goes like this. The Israelites are delivered from its destruction. They're even able to destroy the ones who hate them and oppress them. Esther goes down in history as one of the greatest queens of all time, and Mordecai becomes one of the most honored men in the entire Bible. Second in the kingdom, and as we say, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Mordecai was a great man of tremendous influence. As the old saying goes, any man can be a father, but it takes devotion, ability, and determination to be a dad. This morning, you may not be a child of God. This morning, you may not have the hope that we as Christians have when we come together. If you're outside of Christ, Paul tells us very clearly that you can be baptized into Christ. Well, wouldn't you like to be in Christ? If you're outside of Christ, we'll give you the opportunity to do that today. Maybe you're a child of God and you haven't walked the way you ought to walk. Maybe, and I'd say most of us dads probably feel this way, maybe we haven't been perfect as a dad, and today is a day that we can rededicate ourselves to being the dad we ought to be. Not just a father, but a dad in every respect of the word. If you need to renew your life, if you need to renew your commitment, if you need public prayer, if you need to